Hello, folks. I am Eric Hartman, Director of Advocacy for the Choroideremia Research Foundation, and I'm here today with an exciting and very important webinar about genetic testing. First, I want to thank our corporate sponsors for this series of webinars, and that is Allergen and Biogen. They've been very generous, and it's certainly been a great outreach to our global CHM family. As you guys saw in the title, it is genetic testing. And we here at the CRF know through our own global CHM family that over 3/4 of our patient population were originally clinically diagnosed as having retinitis pigmentosa, or RP. And it wasn't until a genetic testing confirmation was made that they realized they had CHM. In fact, we had one family that was genetically tested in England, but they had a group of 48 living relatives in Ireland that actually had RP diagnoses, but had not been genetically tested. So it's incredibly important to make sure that we get genetic testing. And part of the idea of genetic testing is also to better understand what genetic testing is. And as the science has moved on, so has the knowledge base and the ability for us to educate our patient population, primarily through genetic counselors. The Choroideremia Research Foundation started genetic testing about 10 years ago. And as you know, it was a little cumbersome. It took a long time. And basically, people were getting results in the mail, but no real support. And across the world, there are different access capabilities by each country for genetic testing. I know that in the EU and France and in England, because I've spoken to the EU genetic counselors for ophthalmology there, that they now are doing any person with an inherited retinal disease will get genetically tested. But today I want to talk about genetic testing, and to do that, I have the Foundation for Fighting Blindness's Ben Shaberman, who is the Senior Director of Scientific Outreach and Community Engagement, along with Michelle Glaze, who is the Assistant Director for Professional Engagement. These guys know everything possible and also how to be able to explain it to we, the patient population, about what genetic testing is, and also, in this case, to talk about a very exciting program that the Foundation for Fighting Blindness, the FFB, has for patients in the United States. It's a free program. So, Ben, I would like to welcome you and Michelle. Ben and I have actually known each other for almost, I think, at least 8 years, at least going back through my email history. So, Ben, welcome.
Well, thank you, Eric. It is a pleasure to be part of your program. And yes, we have known each other for a long time. I see you at ARVO. I participated in your conference in Denver, and it's great to have the Choroideremia Research Foundation as a partner. So just a little background on Michelle and me. We are the FFB's professional outreach team. You know, like the CRF, our main focus at FFB are patients, and our main mission is to fundraise for research. And much of that money comes through outreach to patients. But about 1.5 years ago, we started our small but mighty professional outreach team. And what Michelle and I do, and actually Michelle does a lot more of it than I do, is reach out to eye care professionals, retinal specialists, ophthalmologists, optometrists around the US to educate them about the resources that are available for patients with IRDs, including the many resources from the Foundation Fighting Blindness. I actually play a lot of roles at FFB. One is to help lead this team It's really Michelle who does the day-to-day heavy lifting and the outreach to the doctors and organizing our webinars and events. She does that when she's not fighting hurricanes. She lives in Mobile, Alabama, and I don't need to tell your story, Michelle. You can probably tell it better than me. But as many of you may know, a hurricane went through about a week ago, and fortunately, she got power and internet back fairly recently.
Yes, it was, a wild week last week, but we're all safe. So,
yeah, I just want to say that this whole webinar came about because both the CRF and we have our program, our CARS program about contact a retinal specialist, because we were beginning to do our own outreach. And in my conversations with Ben, I realized there was some serious overlap. So I'm thrilled to have both of you here today.
Well, we're thrilled to be here. So our talk will there'll be an introduction to the foundation, a little overview of genetics for those of you that want a little refresher on genetics, and then we'll get into genetic testing and the foundation's My Retina Tracker genetic testing program. And I think we're going to have plenty of time for questions. I prefer to answer them at the end so we can just get through our slides. And but I presume you use the chat function, Eric, for people who have questions.
Yes, I'm sorry, I failed to mention that. If any of you do have questions, please put them in the chat function, and our wonderful coordinator, Beth Foss, will be reading those and grouping them. And when we begin our Q&A session, we'll start there and then see if there are any continuing questions at the end of this presentation. So please use the chat function if you want to post any questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. So a little bit on the Foundation Fighting Blindness. We're actually moving into our 50th year. We're in the early stages of planning our 50th anniversary, which is very exciting. And we will celebrate whether COVID is active or not. We'll find a way. But in our 50 years, we've raised more than $800 million toward our primary mission of driving research, raising money for research. And we fund research for a variety of different types of projects, from lab research in academic centers to translational projects to move treatments out of the lab into clinical trials. We do fund some clinical trials, at least early stage trials. We support career development awards to help doctors and researchers solidify their career in our space. We also fund some natural history studies, and we'll be talking today about our registry and no-cost genetic testing program. And we do fund research for the entire spectrum of inherited retinal diseases, including dry AMD. And I just wanted to make an historical note that we've funded Miguel Seabra at the University College of London for many, many years in his work in choroideremia, and ultimately development of a mouse model and a gene therapy. We also funded Jean Bennett at University of Pennsylvania for her work in choroideremia as well. So we have had a commitment to choroideremia. The projects that we're funding now that might help choroideremia patients tend to be more cross-cutting. That is, they're disease independent. But it's exciting to see all the gene therapy trials that are underway for CHM. And so we also provide a variety of resources for our patients, local chapters. Our site has a lot of information on diseases and the research underway, and of course, genetic testing, which we're moving toward in this presentation. So I wanted to give you just a quick overview of genetics and gene mutations. So genes every cell in our body has a complete set of genes. Genes are the code that really are responsible for who we are. And you can think of genes as being like recipes, more specifically. So what makes our cells work, what keeps them healthy, what prevents disease, hopefully, what helps them do the things that they're designed to do, are proteins. And genes encode for proteins. Genes are like the recipes for proteins. So what happens in the cell is that the cell reads the genetic information like it might a recipe, so it knows how to make the protein. And genes are comprised of these 4 molecules, these 4 nucleotides that we represent by the letters A, G, T, and C. So you can think of genes as being like these very long extensions of letters, of these 4 letters. And again, the cell reads these letters so it knows what proteins to make. Now, there are many, many variations in these letters that are completely benign, that don't really have any impact on our health and well-being. But sometimes there's a variation, a misspelling that's deleterious. And what it leads to is either the wrong protein being made or not enough protein being made. And that's where problems happen. That's what usually happens when a retinal disease occurs, an inherited retinal disease. Now, the good news, if there is good news in these conditions, is that it's usually just one gene that's the culprit. So it's a much clearer target than things like cancer or heart disease or some other conditions that are very genetically complex. In the inherited retinal disease space, it's much simpler. It's a one gene, usually a one gene situation. So looking in a little more detail on what happens when a mutation occurs. And in this diagram, I have a hypothetical normal gene at the top, and there are 4 nucleotides that are represented, A and T, C and G, and that's the normal gene. Well, below it, it's showing that the A has been replaced by a C, and that's a mutation. That C is not what normally should occur in this particular hypothetical gene. And when there's a single letter misspelling, we call that a point mutation. And with all the genetic information within a gene or our entire set of genes, even one single letter misspelling can be very problematic. And there are other ways that a gene can be mutated. Sometimes there's extra information that's inserted into the gene. That's called aptly an insertion. Sometimes there's missing information. That's called a deletion. And then often mutations occur in what we call the coding regions of genes. And I'm not going to go into the details of that too much, but the deeper parts of our genes are known as introns, or the non-coding regions. And sometimes the mutations can occur there in these intronic regions. And those tend to be harder to find and identify. So I guess the main point I'm hoping you take away from this slide is that there are many ways that a gene can be mutated, from these single letter misspellings to insertions, deletions, and so on. So that's the quick overview of genes and gene mutations. So why is it so important that if you're a patient with an inherited retinal disease like choroideremia, why is it important that you get genetically tested? Well, and I'll expand on this in a couple of slides. But just because a doctor looks at the back of your eye and thinks you have choroideremia, or maybe thinks you have RP, doesn't mean that's actually what you have. Even the best doctors can be, quote unquote, fooled by what they may see upon a clinical examination. A clinical diagnosis is critical to getting to a more definitive diagnosis. But it's often a genetic test that will reveal the mutated gene and give you a more definitive diagnosis. So again, a clinical diagnosis is important, but it's not, the jury is still out until you find that mutated gene. And our genetic counseling partner, whom I will talk more about later in this presentation, Informed DNA, showed that for the typical IRD patient in their system, their diagnosis changed, their clinical diagnosis changed in 13% of cases after genetic testing. So that's not a huge number, but it's not an insignificant number. And getting a genetic diagnosis is not only critical to getting a more accurate diagnosis, but it helps you understand how that condition may affect other people in your family, what other family members are at risk for the condition. It also will help you understand your prognosis better, what vision you may or may not retain as you get older. And then perhaps most excitingly for people with IRDs, we now have somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 clinical trials underway for emerging therapies, including gene therapies for choroideremia. And we're approaching the 3-year mark, but the first gene therapy for an inherited retinal disease was actually FDA approved, and it's called Luxturna. And again, this happened almost 3 years ago in December of 2017. Now that's for people with LCA or RP caused by mutations in the gene RPE65. But hopefully in the coming years, we'll have more and more therapies that cross this finish line. And these genetic therapies will require that people have a genetic diagnosis.
And then if I just may add in here, I actually have retinitis pigmentosa myself, but my vision isn't indicative of that. I have a more central vision loss versus peripheral vision loss. And for a long time, physicians, until I got genetically tested, it was maybe this is cone rod dystrophy, or maybe this is Stargardt disease, or maybe it's RP. So even as a person with vision loss due to an inherited retinal disease, what we see may indicate or make us think that we have a particular disease, and in fact, we have something else. For myself, I was following Stargardt, disease research and trials and looking into that, because for a long time I thought I had that or cone rod dystrophy. But once I got genetically tested, it was confirmed that I have retinitis pigmentosa. So, it's important that we know so that we can, as patients, take a look and see what's out there for our particular genetic mutation. Just wanted to add that in.
Thanks, Michelle. That's a good story. I know when we first met and you came on board, you were kind of fuzzy about, I think I have RP, but then say I have a cone rod dystrophy, and so yeah, ultimately it was clarified. So on that note, I reached out to one of the genetic counselors that we work closely with at Kellogg Eye Institute. Some of you may actually know her, Carrie Branham, and asked her for some genetic testing information on choroideremia patients that are in our My Retina Tracker patient registry. And I think this underscores some of the points that Michelle and I have been making about the importance of getting a genetic diagnosis. So I'm going to show you 2 slides of little analyses she did on choroideremia patients. And so this first analysis was of 38 males that were originally clinically diagnosed with choroideremia. So what that means is their eye doctor, optometrist, ophthalmologist, it could have been, you know, a leading retinal expert at an academic institution. But when they looked at the back of people's eyes, what they thought these folks had, or these men, was choroideremia. And so this particular cohort was 38 males. And after genetic testing, they did confirm that 28 had a mutation in choroideremia in the CHM gene. Now, another 7 were considered to be negative or inconclusive. And that still occurs in somewhere between 25 and 30%, maybe 35% of patients who get genetically tested. We simply don't get a definitive answer. And that happened in 7 of these 38 males. So they still might have CHM as their underlying mutated gene, but sometimes the mutations are difficult to find. They could be deletions or intronic mutations that just didn't get picked up in screening. Or these folks could have mutations in a different gene that weren't identified. So inconclusive truly means inconclusive. We're still not sure what these folks have. But then another 3 turned out to have mutations in RP genes. One had a mutation in RPGR, another PRPH2, and another in CNGA1. So these 3 of these folks, men who they thought had choroideremia mutations, actually had RP mutations. And what's so important is not only did they realize they shouldn't be paying attention necessarily to the choroideremia research, there happens to be 3 clinical trials underway for RPGR gene therapy right now. So getting that diagnosis clarified is really important for that person who had mutations in RPGR. And then as part of this particular analysis, Carrie also found a cohort of 13 females that were clinically diagnosed with choroideremia. And I think this is an important point, is that while choroideremia is an X-linked condition, and women are normally thought of, or often thought of, as being carriers, they can actually be affected as well at varying degrees. Sometimes the symptoms may be very mild, sometimes they may be much more significant, like a male with choroideremia. So in this cohort, 13 females were clinically diagnosed and 5 had a mutation identified in CHM. So that's one analysis. Another analysis that Carrie did was of 61 males and females who were in the registry with a genetic choroideremia diagnosis. And what she found out, this is really revealing, is that only 33 of these people started off with a clinical diagnosis of choroideremia or being a choroideremia carrier. Actually, another 22 had a clinical diagnosis of RP or some kind of rod-cone dystrophy. And then another few had other diagnoses of choroidal dystrophy, quote unquote, atypical RP, and even one was diagnosed with Usher syndrome because they had some hearing loss, which was ultimately determined to be unrelated to their vision loss. So this is again showing that what doctors initially thought people had turned out to be very different once they got a genetic diagnosis. So again, thanks to Carrie Branham for that information. So I want to jump into our no-cost genetic testing program, which not only includes genetic testing, it includes no-cost genetic counseling. And if you desire, whether you get genetically tested or not, you can be in our My Retina Tracker patient registry, which is a great way to get on the radar screen of the research community and therapy developers who are conducting clinical trials. So Blueprint Genetics has a great panel. It's broad, it's deep. I'll be talking more about that in another slide or two. Informed DNA is really a leading provider of genetic counseling for people with IRDs. There really is no other group in the US that has more experience and knowledge in our space. And My Retina Tracker is a registry that's been around now for 6 or 7 years. We're almost up to 16,000 registrants. And again, it's a great way to get on the radar screen of the research community. And an important aspect of our program is we're not just a panel. We're not interested in a specific gene or a specific condition. We're really trying to help as many patients and families get on the path to better managing their inherited retinal disease. And identifying the gene is part of that, but getting good counseling is part of that, and getting in our registry to get, again, on the radar screen of the research community is part of that as well. We're trying to help as many people as we can, and we're trying to help as many people get in the research pipeline as possible. So there are other genetic testing alternatives out there, but I feel confident in saying that ours is really the most patient-centric. It's really trying to help the patient manage their condition and get them on the path to treatments and cures.
Ben, I want to just say that that is a huge part of genetic testing, is to have the counseling. There was a recent study done by the Cleveland Clinic, and it found that there was a very minimal request by physicians, once a genetic test was done, to refer genetic counselors to those patients. So I think it's crucially important for the patients to get better informed, and the place to do that is through a genetic counselor. And that's why this program really spoke to the leadership of the CRF in being able to promote it.
That's a great point, Eric. And we require genetic counseling. So if you happen to go to a clinic that has a genetic counselor and your doctor wants to use their genetic counselor in their clinic, that's fine. But we require genetic counseling because the reports that come back, whether they're conclusive or not, can be quite cryptic. And you really need a genetic counselor to interpret the report and then make suggestions about helping the family move forward. And I have a whole slide on genetic counseling, and both Michelle and I will talk more about that.
Well, and two, I wanted to just mention that, you know, the genetic testing program through the foundation not only provides a very holistic approach, but it also connects individuals with vision loss as a result of an inherited retinal disease to the Foundation Fighting Blindness, to other people who have, you know, gone through the vision loss journey, to avenues for, you know, learning about your diagnosis, what research is going on. You know, we host events. It's a community. And so, you know, this program is not only a genetic testing program, but it's also an opportunity for individuals to learn more about, you know, the low vision community as a whole, and connect with others and better understand what is out there and available to assist all of us who have an inherited retinal disease. And I think that that's a very important aspect of our program.
Yeah, I fully agree. In fact, our foundation has sponsored travel scholarships for the American group of ophthalmologic genetic counselors. And I spoke to them about this time last year at their meeting in San Francisco, which was also part of ARVO. And then I also went to Glasgow to speak to the UK eye genetics group there to better explain our condition. And it's been a huge help to be able to get to know the genetic counselors and to let them know the resources that your foundation and my foundation have out there for patients with these diagnoses.
Great. Thanks for underscoring those points, Michelle and Eric. So on my next slide, I just wanted to talk more about the actual genetic test and what to expect. The program is open to any patient that's been clinically diagnosed in the US with an inherited retinal disease. And I realize there are a lot of international patients who obviously need genetic testing as well. Right now, the no-cost program is not available internationally. There are complications for us when we start crossing international borders and offering our program. With that said, there are a lot of good genetic counseling genetic testing opportunities. I know in Europe, whether it's England or the Netherlands or France. But again, for now, our program is only available in the US. And really, any doctor who can make a clinical diagnosis of an IRD can order the test. So that means retinal doctors, ophthalmologists, and in most states, an optometrist can order a genetic test. But there are, I want to say, about a dozen states in the US where the optometrist cannot. So that needs, if you want to get a test through an optometrist, he or she needs to make sure that they're able to do that within their state. And so again, open to anybody with a clinical diagnosis. The only caveat is if you've been tested over the last 4 years, and I know I have 3 years in this slide, I need to update it, it's 4 years. If you've been tested with a panel of 32 or more genes over the last 4 years, you need to wait for that 4-year period to finish up before you can get retested again in our no-cost program. And we felt that that was a fair way to keep our costs at a reasonable level. And every 3 or 4 years, additional mutations and genes, enough of those are found that retesting makes sense, at least through our no-cost program. So since our program began, we're going into our 4th year now, we've had more than 8,000 people order the test. So we've been doing this for a long time, and Blueprint's been doing this for a long time. And the way the test is ordered, this is very important, is your doctor orders it directly from Blueprint. You don't contact FFB, don't call up Eric. Well, you can call up Eric and say hello, but don't try to get a genetic test requisition from him. Your doctor orders it straight from Blueprint. And if you want to give your doctor information about the program, you can go to our website, the Foundation Fighting Blindness website, go to the Open Access Genetic Testing tab, and there are documents, PDFs you can download to give to your doctor. There's one for you, there's one for your doctor. But it's pretty straightforward. Your doctor orders the test and the counseling online, much like they would order another lab test. And the turnaround right now is about 4 weeks. That's vastly improved over the turnaround in past years. And you do not have to be part of the My Retina Tracker registry to order the test. Likewise, you don't have to have a genetic diagnosis to be part of My Retina Tracker registry. But we do strongly encourage you to be part of the registry, and I'll be talking about that more in a moment. And again, genetic counseling is required, whether you do it through Informed DNA or the doctor or the clinic who's ordering the test. So an important aspect of our program is protection of patient privacy. We do not share any personal information with any outside entity when you participate in the genetic testing, the genetic counseling, or our registry. There are other no-cost programs that when you sign the forms, you sign the consent, you also give up your protection to your personal information. And at that point, the vendor can do whatever they want with that information. We do share information, but it's de-identified data. It's mainly disease information to help researchers. And I'll be talking more about how we maintain patient privacy while helping you get connected to clinical trials. I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. So a little bit more on the genetic testing panel from Blueprint. It's expanded over recent years. I think it was just 3 years ago, it was 185 genes. It's up to 322. And it also includes the gene RPGR, which is a fairly common gene in the whole spectrum of IRDs. In fact, it causes nearly 6% when it's mutated of all inherited retinal diseases. And as I showed on an earlier slide, sometimes X-linked RP and choroideremia can be confused. So it's important when you get your genetic test to know that RPGR is in that panel, because it could be, not likely, but it could be that RPGR is the mutated gene. Part of the reason I mention this gene is that other panels may not have it in their screening system. It's a difficult gene to screen. It's got repetitive elements to it which make it challenging to screen. But Blueprint's done a good job in including it in its panel. And not only does Blueprint find those what I'll call low-hanging fruit mutations, they also do a good job finding the harder to identify mutations like insertions and deletions, and those mutations that occur in the non-coding regions, the intronic mutations. So moving on to genetic counseling, we've already talked quite a bit about genetic counseling and how outstanding Informed DNA is. And just to give you some metrics for the breadth of their experience, over the past 3 years, they've counseled more than 3,000 patients with inherited retinal diseases. So this is a core part of what they do. And most of the doctors who use our program do opt for Informed DNA genetic counseling rather than using somebody else or somebody in their clinic. More than 90% have. The counselors at Informed DNA have an average of 7 years of clinical genetic counseling experience. They have someone who's licensed in every state, so we have all 50 states covered, and their counseling is telephone-based, which obviously these days is really important since we're not getting out and about, but it's normally telephone-based, COVID or not. And what this provides the patient is not only protection from COVID, but the counseling session can be made early in the morning. It can be scheduled later in the day, in the evening. So there's a lot of flexibility when you schedule your counseling session. The sessions are 60 to 75 minutes. So there's a lot of time for both the patient and the family to ask questions and walk away from that experience understanding what their prognosis and path forward is. And as I've already said a couple of times, genetic counseling is required. So moving on to our registry, My Retina Tracker. It's been around now for at least 6 or 7 years. I know we did a pilot for a little while before we released it to the general public, but it's available at myretinatracker.org. It's a global registry. Anywhere, people from anywhere in the world can upload their records to it. It's easy to use. Most of the information that's put into the registry is done through pull-down menus. That minimizes the chances of errors. We've recently moved to a new platform, which has made it even more easy to use for people with low vision and those who use screen readers like JAWS. And it's highly secure. The engine that we use, the vendor IQVIA, has a highly secure engine that's being used by a lot of other companies and government institutions. And really getting in the registry is the way for you to get on the, again, as I keep saying, on the radar screen of researchers. We have to remember that inherited retinal diseases, choroideremia, is rare. And when researchers are doing studies and launching clinical trials, it's really important that they be able to identify enough patients for clinical trials. And that's a big role for my Retina tracker. So it's a way for you as a patient to stand up, raise your virtual hand and say, hey, here I am for a research study or a clinical trial. We have companies and researchers who are coming in and looking at the data, perhaps looking for particular people with a particular gene mutation. And even though they might not be launching a trial imminently, they may be thinking about a trial a few years down the road. But if they know now, they can find a critical mass of people to participate in the trial. That's a big boost to their confidence in developing the therapy. So when a company or a researcher comes to us and is doing clinical trial recruitment, they never get your personal information from the registry. What happens is when they do a search, they get an alphanumeric identifier, which they give to us at the Foundation Fighting Blindness and our registry administration. Then we contact you, we map that to your name, we contact you, the patient and the family, and say, hey, this company is recruiting for a clinical trial. If you match their criteria, at least initially, if you're interested in being in that trial, you contact the company. So that's how we maintain patient privacy. It's you who does the outreach back to that, that clinical trial recruiter. As I mentioned earlier, we have 16,000 active registrants. We've gotten somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 requests for data access from researchers and companies. So we're very pleased with how popular the system is. And we're getting more and more partners, companies, who are helping sponsor the registry, alleviating our costs because these companies see such value in the data that we're collecting and the clinical trial recruitment tool that it is.
Ben, I just want to say that I know it was, and there may be a number of people that are on this call who were part of the beta test. You guys, we partnered with you when this, my Retina tracker was first beginning, and after you guys tested it with some of your board and leadership, the CRF promoted it, and I think for a while we were a pretty significant early patient group that was participating in the My Retina tracker.
Well, I probably knew that, but I forgot it, so I'm glad you made that point. So thank you, Eric. Before I move on to the next slide, I wanted to have Michelle tell a little story about genetic counseling and the benefit that it provided her. Michelle, I know we're backing up a slide, but it looked like you dropped off for a minute.
Yes, technology. I'm sorry. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay. Sorry,
so I'm going to go back to the previous slide. We're going to back up to our genetic counseling slide.
Yeah, so I just, I had a really great experience with informed DNA, and, certainly, for most of you, inheritance patterns probably isn't a big question mark, but for me personally, when I had my genetic testing done, my genetic mutation that was identified was RP1. I had, one variant of unknown significance, though, in that assessment. And so for a long time, I didn't know whether my RP was recessive or dominant. I'm a mother. I have a 12-year-old little boy and, well, a 12-year-old big little boy. But for a long time, I didn't know how likely it was that he would be affected. And so I got my genetic testing done long before my Retina Tracker program was available. And so it was done through a separate entity. And for about, well, I guess from 2013 until 2019, I really didn't know whether or not I needed to be concerned about my son and the possibility of him having RP down the road. But when I joined the team at the Foundation Fighting Blindness, Ben encouraged me to contact Informed DNA so that I could get some genetic counseling. And I mean, from start to finish, Informed DNA was amazing. So even if you have received genetic testing outside of the My Retina Tracker program, if you have questions about your results, they are unbelievable. I mean, they are very patient focused. I contacted the company. They did a prior authorization to see if my insurance would cover the genetic counseling, and they were able to determine that it would. My counselor contacted me via phone, so I didn't have to worry about traveling to a facility, hiring a driver, trying to figure out where to go. All I had to do was answer my phone when my genetic counselor called me. And they're very thorough. They spent, that first call, they spent about an hour and 20 minutes on the phone with me. I had sent them my genetic testing results prior. The counselor did a family history. She asked me about my vision loss journey, several questions, and then really dove into explaining my genetic testing results. And, through that call, one of the things that she uncovered was that my parents had both been tested because we were trying to figure out exactly what was going on due to the variant of unknown significance. And after the call, she asked if she minded, if I would give her the green light to go ahead and do some further research and contact the facility where I had my genetic testing done. She went above and beyond and actually reached out. She got copies of my parents' results. She reviewed the new data and research that had been uncovered since my genetic testing was done in regards to that RP1 variant of unknown significance, and then scheduled an additional counseling session. It was all done within about a month's time from my first call with her. And in my case, it was so wonderful because she called me back and she was able to share with me that RP1 variant of unknown significance had been reclassified to likely pathogenic. Based on the information I had shared with her about my vision loss, my family history, the review that she did of both my mom and dad's genetic testing, she was able to tell me that my RP is recessive. And so for my family and for my son and for my peace of mind, that was huge because for so long I just didn't know. And I've learned to deal with my vision loss and all, but I was always worried about my kiddo. So I just have wonderful things to say about Informed DNA and couldn't recommend them more if you have any questions and are in need of a genetic counselor.
Michelle, that's a really great point, and I just want to reiterate to our members that it's not just the men who are predominantly affected. There are known females within our population that do have full-blown choroideremia, but we also know that there are a number of symptoms that can be later onset for our carriers. And that's why I believe it's so incredibly important for the carriers, for the family themselves to all get genetically tested, because I know that we as the CRF are funding a lot of research right now trying to determine what might be some of the pathogenesis of this disease in hopes of getting, besides gene therapy, neuroprotective therapies and other things that could also help benefit our carriers as they get older. So I think it's incredibly important for patients and their family members to get tested and to get that genetic counseling.
Great points. Thanks, Michelle, Eric. One point I wanted to make about genetic counseling is when you get it through our program, it's no cost. So it's part of the no-cost genetic testing. If you've already been tested and you still want to talk to a counselor, you can reach out to Inform DNA. But there could be a cost. I think in about 50% of cases, insurance will cover the session, but if not, there is an out-of-pocket cost. The other nice thing about Inform DNA, when you do use them through our program, is they will help you get into My Retina Tracker, begin a record. So that's a nice side benefit.
And they will too upload, if you want them to upload your genetic testing results into your registry record, if you will, they'll do that as well, if that's something that you're interested in.
Right. Yeah, actually Blueprint will automatically do that if you want. So you don't have to worry about entering in that cryptic code. Good point. So I think, the last point I wanted to make, and I made this earlier, is your doctor orders it directly from Blueprint. And again, you can visit our website, fightingblindness.org, go to the genetic testing tab, and then the open access genetic testing menu item, and you can download information to give to your doctor so he or she knows what the process is.
And I was going to mention too, before I dropped off, if you have any problems with, encouraging your physician to provide this test, or if you're curious about perhaps a physician that is relatively local to you who is already utilizing the program, the My Retina Tracker program, please feel free to email me, and I can help connect you with a doctor who is, perhaps already registered and utilizing this program, and or I'm happy to reach out to your doctor to help get them connected with Blueprint or a representative as well. So I'm happy to help in that way if I can.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, for offering that help. And I think that brings up an important point, is that for some doctors, this is an entirely new, not only process, but concept. And some doctors just may not be comfortable with it because they don't understand it. And frankly, they're too busy seeing so many patients every day that they don't want to take the extra time to learn the process. So thanks, Michelle, for offering to help connect people with doctors who are interested in genetic testing.
Ben, I want to thank both you and Michelle for this great presentation, and I appreciate your offer of assistance to our patients in trying to connect them. This is why I was intrigued by this program, and it's a great collaboration. Let me call on Beth Foss, who, because she also has really great sight, is going to be checking our Q&A to relate any questions. Again, if you have any questions, please use the chat function, and I'll turn it over to Beth for Q&A.
All right, we do have some questions here from our audience. We have a Dr. Praveen, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, more of a comment and a question. So the question is, in India, which laboratory is best for genetic testing for RP, and how many genes will be tested in a complete panel? If you happen to know that question.
I definitely do not know the answer to that question. If you email me, Dr. Praveen, I do have an associate who is more familiar with India. Let me know where you are in India or what region you're interested in, and hopefully I can connect you with the right lab. But offhand, I do not know. Again, our program is only available in the U.S. and honestly, the other centers that I know well are mostly in Europe.
Okay, here's a comment that the doctor made as well. There are many studies shown that show the benefit of red light therapy, saffron, and transcorneal electric stimulation has greatly improved vision in AMD. Which red light device and transcorneal electric device and supplements you advise, and please don't tell it's not FDA approved. We can use if not approved. Also, can we send blood samples to the UK or anywhere from India for testing?
So to answer the last question, I'm not aware of a connection between India and the UK. You might reach out to Moorfields Eye Hospital in London. As far as the AMD therapies that you mentioned, or the retinal disease therapy, saffron, transcorneal stimulation, and red light therapy, to my knowledge, based on the clinical studies that I'm aware of, and whether they've been peer-reviewed or not, I'm not aware that they are therapies that are regularly prescribed by members of our scientific advisory board who consult us on clinical trials and therapies and things like that. I know there may be some evidence of transcorneal stimulation, and I'm thinking back to a German group, but part of the problem is the way these, well, there can be two issues, is the robustness of the clinical trials that have been done to ensure that the treatments are safe and that they really work. And then secondly, if these are done without FDA monitoring, again, then the safety and also the efficacy can come into question. So honestly, I am not going to recommend or comment on any of those potential therapies.
Ben, that's a good point. And I just want to say that on questions like that, I think we're going to try and limit our questions to those dealing with the genetic testing here, because that's who these experts are. And on clinical questions like that, that's something completely different. And I'd rather not delve too deeply into that water there.
But,
so Beth, do we have other questions?
But one important point I just want to make that I do feel comfortable saying is that the foundation, we're very, very committed to promoting research and potential therapies that have strong clinical programs, clinical trial programs, and that the results are peer-reviewed, and that when appropriate, the FDA or the EMA in Europe is monitoring that research to ensure safety and efficacy. That's what the foundation is committed to when we are considering or thinking about research.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We have two more questions, both from Kat. First one is, how young should or can you get your children tested for CHM? I have CHM genetically tested, and I have 2 sons, but just had a daughter 3 months ago. Congratulations, Kat. Also for the females, can you tell if she will just be a carrier or have symptoms? That's the first question. I'll get to her second after you answer it.
Sure. Well, I have a very simple answer to a very complicated question. The answer is genetic counseling, especially for children. We really recommend that you speak to a genetic counselor about the pros and cons, especially of having kids tested, especially when they're asymptomatic or they're so young you don't know if they may be affected or not.
And Ben, just another quick note here, and I don't think we mentioned it. One of the unique things of this genetic testing program of yours is the fact that you use saliva and not blood. Is that correct?
It is. You just spit in it.
And yeah, and that makes things so much easier. So when there is testing for children, it makes it a whole lot easier, and it makes it easier for everyone, because the early genetic testing program that our foundation had was the drawing of blood, and that proved to be very problematic. Though I will say, Ben, when it comes to testing younger kids, and again, I fall back with you to genetic counseling, but as these therapies begin to progress, depending on the therapies, the earlier the intervention, especially for choroideremia and other patients, the more sight, hopefully, in the future we will be able to save. So it definitely has its pros and cons, but I can certainly see how parents certainly want to be able to plan that for their children's upbringing and for their safety, is to know in advance whether or not the child may have the disease, whether or not it's disclosed as something completely different.
All right, so this is kind of cute. So it's Kat's computer, but it's actually her husband, Glenn, that's asking the questions. So hello, Glenn. So here's the second question that they have. Let me glance down. Is genetic testing a one-time shot? I got it once, but was more thrilled to finally have a diagnosis and looking forward. Also, I learned something new today in that my new daughter may not only be a carrier, but could also have symptoms. Is that the case?
It is that females can be affected. And I guess going back to the previous question from that person, if I understood it correctly, once you get a definitive answer, a genetic diagnosis through a genetic test, if it's a CLIA certified lab, you trust the lab and it seems to make sense, then I can't think of a reason why you would want to get another genetic test. I'll never say never. Maybe there's something unusual about the test. Maybe there's some second gene that the doctor or counselor is worried about, but once you have a diagnosis, you should be good.
And I just want to comment on Glenn's question that yes, there can be symptoms, Glenn. In many cases, they're late onset. There are known cases of genetically tested females that end up having a much stronger and almost and equal to the male symptoms for the progression of the disease. But many carriers will develop certain symptoms like problems with glare or potential problems of night vision as they get later in life. Our foundation's about to launch a survey of female patients to better ascertain this, because we know just from our own patient community responses that there are some symptoms out there, and we want to make sure that we're getting that documented. So, yep, Glenn, we don't want to cause you undue concern about your daughter, but please feel assured that that is something that both the Choroideremia Research Foundation and the FFB are working to better understand with the X-linked IRDs.
And just for clarification purposes, guys, the genetic counseling is just a one-time thing, correct? So if you get that confirmed diagnosis at the beginning, you don't need to go in every 10 to 20 years. Is that correct?
I would say so. I guess the question is, if there's a change in your family, that could beg the need for more genetic counseling. So you have more kids or something. You might have another question that comes up. So I wouldn't rule out another genetic counseling session sometime down the road as a situation changes. I mean, you can learn all about the emerging research from CRF, from us, but you may want to also talk to a genetic counselor about it. So as I'm thinking about it, a session down the road may make sense to clarify additional questions or issues. But initially, the first session should last quite a while. Should be good for a while.
And I was just going to add it, and this might not pertain to this particular family or case, but you know, like myself, if you did receive genetic testing and you know there was a likely, you know, the genetic mutation was likely, but maybe you had a variant of unknown significance, that might be something that you would want to revisit down the road. For example, in my case, you know, that my particular genetic mutation that had a variant of unknown significance was reclassified as the research community gained more data and information about RP1. So, you know, in that scenario, you may want to, you know, to reevaluate and reassess and contact a genetic counselor to see if there is any additional information that can completely confirm a diagnosis. And I hope that I'm conveying that properly. Ben, you can hop in.
I think you make a good point. If your genetic test was not conclusive, the genetic counselor will help you understand what those results mean, but there's a good chance they're going to suggest genetic testing at a later date as the panel gets broader and deeper to see if they can find the gene down the road. And that subsequent test, you're probably going to want genetic counseling again. And I think your case is a good example of where you're following a mutation that they didn't quite understand to see if the classification changed. So that is a good point. Those are good points.
That's a great point. Beth, do we have any other questions?
We do. Yes, we do. So Erica asks the following question. Is RP only confirmed with genetic testing? I was tested on computers with USF that stated I have RP, however, have not had any genetic testing done yet.
So really, it's really the genetic diagnosis that will clarify the ultimate diagnosis. And I think that's a point that I made earlier on. I wouldn't want to question the expertise or skill of a clinician in diagnosing a patient, but it's not until that gene mutation is identified that you really understand what's happening at a molecular level. So I'm not trying to insinuate that you don't have, you may not have RP, but again, it isn't until you get a genetic test and get a result that you really know. Thank
you. We have a question from Graham who asks, I hope I get this right, is there any way UK There might be some there's some typos here. Is there any way UK 100 genome result can be sent to help your program? I bet you guys know what he's talking about. I have RP, but 2 mutations, but they tell me they are probably not contributory. And then he has in parentheses MY07A and CEP168. Does that make sense? I'm sorry if I'm not getting it correct, Graham.
Yeah, I'm reluctant to say too much without quite understanding the question fully. I know MY07A is a Usher syndrome type 1B. It's the gene that, when mutated, causes USH1B. I'm not sure what the other gene could be linked to. I mean, if this person wants to email me, we can talk a little further, but I'm reluctant to say too much without quite understanding exactly what's happening with this person genetically.
And your information here is on the screen still, folks, for both Michelle and Ben's contact information. So please do that. And just as a reminder, we are going to have this on our website, on our YouTube channel. The slides will not be provided to, that was a question somebody had, but we will have this so you can look at it again at your leisure. We had a comment from Dr. Praveen again saying if you could give some more details about RPGR. And he says about India being the world's second highest population country in the world with millions of IRD patients, there are no testing and inclusion criteria here. And he says, please expand your program to India.
Well, I definitely understand the need. I fully understand that. As a US-based organization that follows US-based regulations, that's been our first priority. We do have an interest in expanding internationally from the no-cost genetic testing program, but there are limitations, and some of those are financial too, because the more people we provide the service to, the more costly it is. And it's already a significant investment for us. But again, I will get you in touch with somebody from a researcher who knows more about what's happening in India, and maybe connect you with a facility that's local or more local to you.
That's a great point. And I would also recommend to the good doctor that if you look up Retina International, both the FFB and now the CRF are both members of Retina International, and that has global outreach. And we know Beth and I were at their global assembly just 2 weeks ago, and there are definitely representatives there from India. And if you go to their website, you can certainly get those contacts with the larger groups for retinal studies within India, which might be another resource for access to genetic testing.
That wraps up the questions for today.
Well, I want to thank both Ben and Michelle for this session. This has been really, really great. I want to encourage any of our members who have already gotten genetically tested to reach out to their relatives, because there's a lot of hope and a lot of more informed responses to our own diseases and our disease progression when it is confirmed by genetic testing. I also want to take a moment to thank our corporate sponsors, Allergen and Biogen. But again, Ben and Michelle, thank you so much for this great information. I do know that Michelle has sent me the PDFs that you can also download from the FFB, but we can also send those PDFs out to anybody on this call if they request it, but you can definitely quickly get it there at the FFB with their downloads for information for you as a patient and to give to your doctors. So thank you, Ben and Michelle.
Thank you for having us, Eric.
Thank you, Eric and Beth. It was fun.
Thanks, and this is global. We had England, India, and and a number of other participants here. So we know that the inherited retinal diseases are global. Certainly, we've got patients across the globe, and we will continue with more, hopefully very helpful webinars like this in the future. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great
Thank
day.
you, Beth. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.